for your prints. Now, a little disclaimer before I get started. This, as you might imagine, is a difficult topic to explain, much less demonstrate in this format in a webinar, simply because the nature of prints and paper, it kind of works best when you can hold it in your hand, when you can really experience the physical properties of prints. You can look at the print in different angles under different kinds of lighting conditions. You can hold the prints in your hand, as I said before, and so that's hard to sort of demonstrate to you in terms of what I'm going to be talking about. So for that reason, I'm going to be focusing more on concepts and ideas that you can then apply when you start to make your own prints. I think the concepts are critically important because they'll help you to understand why to choose one paper over another, and then you can again use those ideas to make decisions for your own work. So I have two main goals for the webinar today. One is to talk about the importance of paper selection, right? Why selecting the right paper is important, and as I said before, basic concepts that you can start to use in your approach to selecting the best papers for your images. It's important to understand that choosing the best paper for your images takes practice, and that's not something you're going to learn overnight. And that's okay, because any skill that yields lasting results takes time, and so this is no different. If you learn and apply these concepts, you'll become better at working with papers and your images, and your prints will improve dramatically. You'll also develop a better sense of how papers can complement and even define your style. Before we get into that, let me just share some background information about who I am. I've been a professional landscape photographer and a printmaker for over a decade, and prints have always been a part of my creative work. To me, a print defines the end result. It's the physical manifestation, if you will, of my vision and my efforts, and it provides a sense of completion for me. Sure, computers and mobile devices are great, and I share a lot of my work that way as well, and I'm sure you guys do, you do as well. But for me, a print is something physical, it's tactile, it adds much more to the way an image is perceived than any digital device can, and I'm sure that's why many of you are attracted to printing as well. I've also been a proud Canson ambassador for the past 6 years, which means I help with product development, with education, and I help other photographers and artists like yourselves make informed choices about paper. I'm also privileged and grateful to have my work displayed at Canson's worldwide trade shows. And finally, I write about photography and printing on my blog, and I also teach printing workshops at my studio in upstate New York. Before we get into papers, I also just wanted to mention a few things about Canson, the company, which I also think it's useful to know, and many people do not know. Canson has been in existence for over 400 years and has a deep heritage in paper manufacturing for artists and photographers. Artists over the years, over the decades, over the centuries that have used and trusted paper, Canson paper, include Caravaggio, Degas, Matisse, Van Gogh, Picasso, Warhol. These are really incredibly important and influential artists, and so it's also important to note that Canson is a true paper manufacturer. They make the papers in their own paper mill in southern France, and that's not the case for most so-called paper manufacturers today. That really translates to the highest quality control, consistency, and all of those things are paramount to the Canson quality. So why does paper matter? I'm going to start with one of my favorite quotes: "The negative is a score, the print is the performance," by, of course, Ansel Adams. And that really defines, I think, why paper is important, because the print and the paper together can combine to interpret the vision of the photographer from the negative, so to speak. First, as I've already mentioned, paper is its own medium, and in the best cases, separate from the original negative or the raw file. And I think if you think of prints this way, you'll start to appreciate how important paper choices can be to achieving the strongest prints for your work. I'm a firm believer in real-world applications over theoretical potential or analysis, for example. So Dmax, which is a function or a measurement of how much black density, how much black a paper can hold, otherwise known as black density. That measurement, while important, it's much less interest to me than how an image actually looks, how a print actually looks, and how it makes a viewer feel. Okay, does the print faithfully reproduce your artistic vision? Does it convey the story of your image? And these questions are the most important to ask, in my opinion, when evaluating the paper you choose for your prints. The answers to these questions should dictate how and why you choose one paper over another. So again, you really have to reflect on what it is you're trying to convey with your work, with your prints, and that will help you to define which paper, and depending on the paper's characteristics, which one is going to complement that vision that you're trying to portray. The way to truly understand how papers influence an image is to learn to trust your most important sense in this case, and that's your eyes. Your intuition should guide you more than the technology or measurements or numbers. Forget what the numbers or the experts say. Use your eyes. Does the print convey what you felt, what you want others to feel when they look at your prints? So the most important concept I want to stress here is the importance of having a vision of what you want to accomplish. And this point is hard to understate. It's the basis of any meaningful print. So while I can't explain how to find that vision in this webinar, I can share some of how I go about choosing papers. And hopefully you can adapt that to your own selection process. So my main thing here is it's not about how I choose papers, but giving you, again, the ideas, the concepts, the tools that you can then turn around and choose the paper that's best for you. I don't want to prescribe formulas. I want to give you the general ideas and a way to determine which paper is best for your prints. Everything I've been discussing so far rests on a specific approach to using papers. I want to spend a few minutes on this because I think it's critically important. You can think of generally two distinct approaches to choosing paper. We can call one the paper-centric approach, which is probably the more common one, or the one that you would perhaps use when you first get started printing. And a paper-centric approach, you evaluate different papers and their characteristics, and then you decide which paper is best for you or your work. This implies that most, if not all, of your images will be printed on the same paper. The other approach, and the one that I prefer, is an image-centric approach. Instead of finding one paper that works best for your images, or even which paper is best for black and white or landscapes, for example, you evaluate each image based on what you're trying to convey, and you choose a paper that best complements or strengthens that vision. This allows you to be much more creative and more unique with your prints, and use the qualities that a great paper can add to your images. It allows you to be you. It allows you to choose papers based on what you're trying to say, instead of simply just defining one paper and then all your images go on that paper. This doesn't mean, by the way, that in my case, for example, that I select from every Canson paper available, because there are just some papers generally that don't complement the style of my images. And again, I'm talking about my particular style. Every photographer is going to have a certain style, a certain approach to the way they want to photograph and what they want to convey. And so that allows you to sort of be more specific about which papers you use. There are some, for me, that seem to work well over and over again. And once I got to know those papers, like, for example, my go-to lenses in my camera bag, I use them for their strengths, and that leads to stronger prints. If a paper-centric approach works for you, that's great. If you're getting the results you want, that's fine. But given that we have a great variety of papers and amazing printers that weren't available to generations of photographers before us, I think it's almost an artistic privilege that we consider how and why to use these tools to express ourselves creatively. So let's talk about paper characteristics. I'm going to break these down into the general categories that make the greatest visual difference in a print. So we have paper surface and the finish. We have density, or Dmax, how much black a paper can hold. Texture, we have the look and feel of a paper. And then, again, your artistic vision, how all these characteristics combine to convey a vision or a style. All of these are determined by the two layers that any paper are made out of. That's the base and the coating. The base or the substrate is what gives the paper its physical appearance, its weight. The base is critically important because it determines the feel of the paper when you hold it in your hand. It can be made of cotton rag fibers, it can be made of alpha cellulose fibers, or any combination of these two. If the way a paper feels in hand is important to you, for example, if you're sharing your prints, loose prints in a portfolio or in a handmade book, then cotton rag papers are generally ideal because they just feel great. I love the feel of a cotton rag paper such as like Canson Edition or Platine Fiber Rag with its cotton backing. It conveys a fine sense of artisanal quality that's kind of hard to duplicate with any other kind of paper. Of course, these are secondary to the look of the image, but they do influence the perception of your print to a viewer. If you're displaying your prints behind glass, framed behind glass, then the feel obviously is not nearly as important or relevant. But the texture and the finish of the paper still has a huge impact on the printed image, and so that would still remain the biggest factor in deciding which paper to use. The surface of a paper, the finish, is what determines its reflectivity. It determines its color gamut, how many colors the paper can reproduce, and the amount of black that the paper can hold and still show good shadow detail, good shadow separation. Black density, otherwise known as Dmax, is important because it defines the total contrast that a paper can again reproduce. The higher the black density, the richer the shadows and the more contrast a printed image will exhibit. Now this is extremely important, not only from an analytical standpoint, but more so aesthetically. Higher contrast not only makes a print look more vivid, it also makes it feel, louder, more aggressive, more in your face. This is neither good nor bad. These are just qualities of the paper and the surface. And it's simply a tool that you can use when considering which paper is best for your image. Louder is not better. It depends on, again, what your print has to say. Perhaps you want a smoother looking print. You want to soften a silhouette. You want to convey the quiet nature of a moment in time. All of these once again refer to the perception of the image and what you want to convey as the photographer. Not what the subject is, but what you want the viewer to see. So let's look at the two broad categories of paper surfaces that are available: matte and luster or fiber. Let's start with matte papers. Matte papers are generally characterized by the following. They have lower Dmax, lower density relative to fiber and gloss papers. They have a more defined surface texture. Paper surface generally has a lower white point than luster or fiber. That means that they may not look as white. That's especially the case with Canson papers because Canson doesn't use any optical brighteners in their matte papers. And so the paper is going to appear to be not as white as, let's say, a fiber or a luster paper. That doesn't mean it's warmer. It's still neutral. It's just not as white. Matte papers also have a really nice fine art look and feel, and they impart a more painterly look to an image. Now, for many, the painterly look is what matte papers are all about. That distinctive look that softens shadows, it adds textural detail, it feels great to hold in your hand. Contrary to what a lot of photographers think, Canson matte papers do not reduce the detail of an image. In fact, they hold high frequency detail extremely well. And this is important because it means you can choose a paper based on its aesthetic qualities, and you don't have to worry about compromising important detail. For example, this image here has a lot of detail. This is printed on a matte paper. I believe it's addition etching rag, and yet it holds all those beautiful details extremely well. It's true that you'll get slightly more perceived detail with a satin or a luster paper, but in my opinion, that's not enough to warrant making a paper choice simply on that factor alone. I print finely detailed landscape images all the time in matte papers, and I'm constantly amazed at how well things like fine grasses, sand, snow, rock textures hold up. This allows for a print that feels organic, yet reproduces the realism of a detailed photograph. The lower contrast of matte papers as compared to, say, luster papers or gloss papers is also one of its strengths when you need subtlety, when you need nuance. That old saying, less is more, applies here when you're thinking about prints that don't yell or scream at you. They lure you in with suggestions, with softer tones, with quiet impressions, for example. A less photographic look to your image can often impart that painterly look that we're all familiar with. But it's not just enough to say you want a painterly look. I think the image itself should already suggest that interpretation. Now, you can use matte papers for any subject matter or any type of image, like black and white, HDR. It all depends on the look and feel you want to convey. Now, while that may seem to make it more difficult to select the right paper, there's no right or wrong choice here. In fact, they may change over time. I've used different papers for the same image over the years as I've grown as a photographer and I've explored and sort of developed my own vision. And it's a great way to reevaluate your feelings about the image and how you're progressing and the path that you're following as a photographer and a printmaker. So the important thing here is that it makes you a part of the creative process, and it helps, again, refine your work and your vision. The next major category that I want to talk about here are the so-called luster or satin or fiber finishes. Any of those terms apply here: semi-gloss, luster, satin, even fiber. These similar finishes are all generally characterized by the following things, right? They have a higher Dmax, more density relative to matte papers. They have smoother surface textures. The paper surface is generally whiter in color, as I mentioned before. They have a higher white point, and they have more of a photographic look and feel. And there are various levels of reflectivity and texture in this category, but in general, we can all call them like luster papers. They're not as reflective as gloss, for example, but definitely more reflective than any kind of matte paper. The critical visual difference is the level of Dmax or black density that these papers can hold, and that's what really makes them stand apart from matte papers. That makes them great choices when you need more contrast, higher contrast in an image, maximum detail, when a more photographic look is desired. Tonal separation in the shadows is a key strength of papers like Platine, Fiber Rag, or Burrito Photographique. And I often select one of these papers when shadows and shadow separation are an important major compositional component of an image. Platine and Burrito, by the way, are part of, and Burrito Prestige are all a part of a special category called fiber papers. And these papers were designed to emulate the look and feel of traditional darkroom prints. So they have generally smooth, silky finish. They feel great to hold and touch, especially a paper like Platine with the cotton backing. And they're just great. They deliver great pop and punch to any image, whether it's black and white or color. I want to spend a few minutes discussing the look and feel of a print, especially when we say a print is more or less photographic. When you say that a paper is more photographic, what we mean is that it presents the image more literally, more like how we would actually see it with our own eyes in reality. In general, luster and glossy and fiber papers tend to make an image look more photographic. And so if that's what you want, then this is definitely something to consider when choosing a paper. Matte papers, on the other hand, exhibit a completely different look. They tend to make an image appear less literal, less photographic, hence the comparison to painting. When we say that a print is softer, more symbolic, more allegorical, more pictorial, for example, it's often due to the use of a matte paper. By the way, this in no way suggests that an image that is very abstract or less literal can't work on a luster or a fiber paper. In fact, a luster paper might be ideal given a specific image. This particular image here, I always print on a matte paper because, again, it does exhibit those qualities that a matte paper helps to bring out. The softness of the image, sort of the symbolic nature of it. It's more of a feel and a mood. I don't really want to show trees. I want to show an experience. And again, a matte paper has a way of really allowing for that separation from the reality of what the photograph is. The key point is that you have to consider all the factors that make an image successful for you and then choose a paper according to that. So for example, Perhaps you have a black and white image like this one here that has shadows. You're trying to convey a sense of serenity, of stillness. It's very soft. There's a foggy nature to the image. There's an ambiance to the image that, again, says that it's quiet, that it's soft, that it isn't loud or in your face. A matte paper is ideal for me anyway, because on the whole, the feel of the moment is what you want to what you want to express, what I'm trying to express, not specific shadow details. Similarly, you might have an image that is also very graphic and perhaps symbolic, and you want it to appear less photographic, but you have shadows and you have shadow detail, and those shadow details are key to conveying the depth of the scene and how it felt to you. And so in this photograph here, while it is sort of graphic and symbolic, almost abstract, those shadows in the bottom right, I need them to really stand out. I need them to be a part of the whole picture. And a matte paper might compromise those just because of the way a matte paper exhibits shadow density. It doesn't have enough density to really bring out the detail that I want. And so a paper like platine, in this case, which is what I use for this image, is ideal. It supports the overall message, not just a part of it. Texture is another critical component. The irregularity of a paper surface is what we commonly refer to as a paper's texture or its tooth. And the coarser the texture, the more noticeable it will be, and the more it'll impact the aesthetic appearance of an image. Understanding how texture interacts with an image is one of the critical things that you need to learn in order to determine the right paper. Texture can add dimension, it can add interest to, for example, the surface of a rock or a pastoral landscape or a clear, a blue sky with clouds. Because texture is a physical irregularity on the surface of the paper, it can blend with similar areas in an image, and it adds extra dimension or even depth. It's something that you can actually see physically. Now, how much texture a paper has will determine how far you want to go before the texture starts to dominate what the viewer sees. So, it's a delicate balance sometimes between where you want to go and as I say, excuse me, less is more. Once you go too far, the texture becomes a distraction. And so it's great to have a variety of papers offered by Canson, where you can find exactly what works for your image. As a principle, the texture should complement the image. Determining when that happens is not so easy, okay, and it really comes from practice, from experience. But when it works, it brings an image to life so that the viewer simply sees the combination of paper and image as a single statement, as a finished print. This print here that you're looking at, I've used a printmaking rag, which is a Canson paper that has a very beautiful smooth texture to it. And because the subject matter itself has a lot of texture, and I want the texture to sort of unify the image throughout, then that texture really helps to complement the nature of the image itself. It helps to add that dimension that I want for the picture. And of course here, density or Dmax isn't critical because I don't want the shadows to become too strong. Again, I want to preserve the light that was in the original photograph and the scene. Now, understanding both the tonal and the textural characteristics of the paper and what you want to say with the image, these are the crucial factors here. Once you start to think of prints as an aesthetic combination of the paper and the image, then you start to improve your printmaking skills dramatically. In fact, you'll start to think about papers when you're making an image, which for me is the ultimate practice of creative vision, right? It's from the capture all the way to making the print. This not only leads to better prints, but a deeper enjoyment of photography in general and of printmaking. It's in this aspect, I think, that Canson papers, never disappoint. I mean, I can always rely on them to provide just the right texture that I need and the finish that I need for whatever image I envision in the field. So let's look at some examples to help you start to think about paper choices conceptually. That doesn't mean you'll know which paper to use every time, but you'll know when you finally decide. So let's consider like an urban or an architectural image, like this one that I have here, that has lots of detail. It has flat reflective surfaces, smooth, concrete, metal, no sky. In fact, the sky is sort of bland, okay? Little to no texture here is ideal in order to emphasize the smoothness and hardness already in the image. I also want to try to make as much tonal separation between the different parts of the building so that I really can create a lot of interest and have subtlety. And for that, a fiber paper like platine fiber rag is ideal, all right, to retain that subtle shadow separation. Platine has a slight amount of texture to it. I wouldn't even call it texture. It's just a beautiful surface interest. And again, that helps to unify the image, especially in the sky area where it's sort of bland. This just sort of helps to keep interest throughout the image. We want the viewer to appreciate the graphic nature of the elements without anything becoming a distraction. So we don't want smooth surfaces to be compromised in any way by using, let's say, a more textured paper, and that would bring more attention to areas that I want to keep smooth. And as I mentioned before, again, showing you this print on platine paper is, much more effective in communicating what I'm trying to express here. But again, with the limitations of technology, that's the best I can do. Now, let's consider another similar architectural image that has lots of sky. Assuming that the sky is integral, which it is in this case. A fiber paper with some subtle texture like platine again would be my first choice, because this is generally photographic. I want to really make sure I bring out all the texture and all the detail, especially in the shadows, and I want to preserve all of the texture of the concrete. But I think the density is the thing that's going to be most important to make sure that that really feels heavy and that it's a literal photograph, very photographic. That's what I would want. And so because the sky is a part of the story here, the texture of platine adds a little bit to that, but I think the density is what really makes the image work throughout. Another example is a baby portrait, for instance. Here, minimal to no texture is probably the way to go in order to preserve the smoothness of the skin. I don't want texture to all of a sudden add something in the skin areas that now become a distraction. I want it to be as smooth as possible. I would also probably choose a matte paper like the one above versus the one below, because a matte paper preserves the feel of the image. It elicits more of a memory, more of a perception of the child at that time versus a more photographic paper, which is much more literal. And so I would want to stay away from a literal paper and go for a paper that's a little bit more symbolic of the moment and the photograph itself. Now let's consider another example. This is a forest scene with areas of fog in the background. We all know and we understand why fog is wonderful to experience and to photograph. It has this tension. It creates this tension between what we can discern, what we see, and what we can't see. It removes a sense of depth. It makes the image, making the things that we can see, that much more wonderful, much more prominent. But the imagination is also stimulated by that unknown. And so I hope by now that you're thinking, in your mind, that lots of texture is probably not the way to go, at least not as a start. I would start with a matte paper to preserve that softness, and also a matte paper that was very smooth to complement what I want the image to convey. As I said before, the areas of fog remain most effective when they are featureless, when they're ephemeral, when there's no texture to make that fog just sort of disappear into the distance and create more depth front to back in the print. Okay, so none of these examples imply a formula. Instead they kind of suggest a way of thinking about photography and your vision as a photographer, and how the surface and the texture plays a role in the final print can be used to your advantage in ways that can be subtle, that can be nuanced, but also very powerful. So ultimately, you want the viewer to simply be carried away by the work without really knowing why or asking themselves what paper did you use, etc. They just see the print and it just captures their imagination. That's when a print, I believe, works best, like any great art form. I want to talk a little bit about glass and texture, because that's also a question that comes up quite often. Contrary to what a lot of people believe, framing an image behind glass does not negate the surface texture of a paper. Yes, it is true that the viewer can no longer appreciate it as much as if there were no glass. You can't touch the paper, and the reflective nature of glass makes the texture less noticeable. But the texture of the paper still affects how the paper feels and how it looks and how light reflects off of a paper. So given that paper is a reflective medium, meaning it changes appearance depending on how light is reflected, it follows that even behind a piece of glass, the texture will still have a significant impact on appearance. Now, again, granted, glass diminishes that to some extent, but it doesn't render all papers equal. A highly textured paper will still bend and refract light much more so relative to a smoother paper, even when they're behind glass. And the glass simply diminishes that to some degree, but it's still noticeable, and it still definitely impacts how your prints are perceived. So, this also points out the importance of using high quality glass, preferably museum glass or anti-reflective glass. So this will really help to maintain the textural qualities of paper when you frame your work behind glass. So let's talk about some of Canson's specific papers, and I'll also offer some tips and my ideas about when to use these papers and what they're best at. Let's start with Platine Fiber Rag, which is one of Canson's most beautiful papers. It's a 100% cotton rag paper, but it has this beautiful fiber finish, high Dmax, great density. It holds shadow detail really well, and it's just got a very, very subtle texture that is almost unnoticeable, but definitely adds a beautiful finish to an image. It adds a certain dimension to the surface that is really nice. And for me, I would use Platine, or I use Platine for an image like this one, where density is really important to maintain the separation of the different layers in this image, from the foreground to the middle ground trees, where the sun is kind of backlighting those trees, to the background. This is hard to experience or to see on your monitor. It's much more obvious and much more visible when you hold the print in your hand. But the density here is the most important thing that I would consider for this print. When I print this image on a matte paper, it loses that separation between the different layers, and it just doesn't have that same sense of depth from front to back. And the surface of Platine also helps with the snow, with the trees, with many things in the image that will just preserve that texture that is a big part of the image. Here's another image that Platine also works particularly well. Again, a very photographic image. This is a portrait, of course, but it's very straightforward. There's nothing that's symbolical, allegorical, abstract about it. It's very photographic, and Platine is really going to make it pop. It's going to add a lot of punch. It's going to really bring out the shadows and the detail, the highlights. All of those black areas, the shadows, are going to be really well conveyed on a Platine paper. And so that would be my top choice for an image like this. Barita Photographique, or Barita Photographique, is another paper from Canson that is also very similar to Platine, except it has a alpha cellulose backing. It's not a cotton rag backing. And also the surface texture is extremely smooth. It's the smoothest fiber paper that Canson offers. And so if you're looking for a paper that has no surface texture at all, it's very smooth and has that great look and feel of a darkroom print, which is why it's called Barita, then this is probably going to be your choice. And for an image like this, again, this image has a lot of texture in it. It has a lot of detail, and so a very smooth paper will not get in the way of that. However, it also has a very literal feel to it. I want those colors to really pop. I want the density, the blacks, to really be strong and to really convey what the image is about. And so Barita would be my top choice on this. If I print this on a matte paper, yes, the texture will complement the texture in the image, but it loses something in terms of its depth because of the blacks and because of the shadows. Those cracks, I want those cracks to really feel as dimensional as possible, and for that I need the density of a Barita to make those stand out. Here's another image that I've printed and do print on Burita. Again, the image has a lot of detail in it, and from top to bottom, and so I don't need a paper that has texture to add texture to it. It's got a lot of texture already. But again, it's the separation in the tones and the dark shadows that make the colors come alive. The shadows tend to be black or gray, and so the colors are more pronounced when I use a paper that, again, has a lot of density, a lot of contrast, like Burita. So Burita, again, is my first choice for this particular image. Burita Prestige is Canson's latest paper that was released a couple months ago in Photokina, and you can think of Burita Prestige as sort of a hybrid between platine fiber rag and the original Burita Photographique. That's to say, it's an alpha cellulose paper like Burita, and it also is the next generation of Burita papers, but it has a slight amount of surface texture, more like platine. Again, very, very, very subtle, very hard to notice, but not quite as smooth as Burita Photographique. Prestige also has a wider color gamut than Burita, which means it holds more colors. It's also a heavier paper. It's 340 grams, very, very stiff, resists curling tremendously, and so it's really a nice paper. I wouldn't say it replaces Burita Photographique. It's just a different kind of paper depending on, again, your image. So for me, an image like this where I don't mind a tiny bit of surface texture on the paper to kind of unify the clouds. The clouds have a lot of interest in them. There's the horizon. There is a lot of texture in the rocks, and also the density of this paper holds the shadow details well. I need to maintain shadow detail in this image, because if not, then the whole bottom half of the image becomes just a little bit too ambiguous, and that's not what I want. I really want to bring out the individual tones in the rocks that are in the foreground, and also make the reflectivity of the water. I want that water to look as though it's really reflecting light. And again, a fiber paper, especially a paper like Burita Prestige, is going to magnify that. It's going to preserve that as much as possible. And so for me, Prestige would be my top choice for this image. So let's talk about matte papers, because I also love matte papers and use them a lot. Rag Photographique is Canson's smoothest rag paper. So again, a lot of what separates the matte papers in the Canson line is the amount of texture that they have, the type of texture, whether it's random, whether it's a little more patterned, how deep the textures are. Rag Photographique is the smoothest paper, meaning it has virtually no texture at all. And that's great when you don't want texture to either interfere or to become a distraction. So once again, I showed this image before. Here's an example of an image where I want the parts of the image that have texture, that have contrast, that have detail to come forward, but I want the rest of it, which is fog, to fade into the distance as much as possible. So it almost looks as though there's nothing about it that you can actually see it has any sort of surface to it. And Rag Photographique is perfect for this, because, again, it helps to elicit the softness of the image. The blacks don't get too dark and dominate the picture, and also the smooth surface of rag helps to really create more depth between the trees and the background. Here's another example where I would use Rag Photographique. Once again, I have black and I have lots of dark areas, but those dark areas are not as important in an image where I need to preserve shadow detail, because those dark areas really lead to the eyes. They lead you to look at the eyes, and they're just sort of a way of balancing out the edges of the image. And so rag, the softness of rag, preserves the feel of the image, and also because rag is very smooth and doesn't have any texture, it doesn't, again, interfere with the face. It allows the face and the portrait and what this picture is about to maintain its soft quality. Addition etching rag is a paper that, while similar to Rag Photographique, it does have some very subtle texture, enough to notice in a print. You can certainly notice it as soon as you look at the paper, but it's not a very coarse texture. It's a very smooth texture that just adds a beautiful element of depth and dimension to any image. So here's an example where addition etching works beautifully for this image for me. because throughout the image, I basically have lots of areas of detail and texture, the rock in the foreground, the middle ground with all those bushes, the mountains in the background, even the sky in the distance has clouds. And so I want all those areas of the image to have some depth or dimension, or I should say the paper adds a certain depth to the image because of the texture. And I think that helps to just make the paper and the print that much more dimensional. And as far as density or Dmax is concerned, once again, I don't need deep dark shadows. This image is softer, it's quieter, it's an image where I want to convey the feel of what I'm trying to share with the viewer and what the image is about in general. And so addition etching and a matte paper in general preserves that sense of what the picture is about. Aquarel rag is Canson's most textured paper. It has a lot of texture to it. You can easily feel it. You can easily see it. Even with that, it holds and maintains detail really well. You can see the picture there behind the boxes of what appears to be a butterfly. And when you look at that print in person, every one of those edges and lines in that illustration looks perfectly detailed, yet it has a beautiful soft quality and dimension to it. So for an image like this, Aquarel rag is ideal because, again, the quality of the image itself, what the image is about, it's about texture. I almost want the viewer to be able to understand what it feels like to put their hand on on this moss, on these trees and these rocks. And so Aquarel, again, helps to complement that. It helps to really push that more into the mindset of the viewer, into what they're experiencing. And once again, density or Dmax is not what's critical here. I'm not going here for ultimate contrast or deep blacks or lots of shadow detail. I really want the viewer to focus in on the color, the textural aspects of the image, sort of the abstract nature of it. And again, Aquarel works for this image. I don't often use Aquarel because its texture is so fine, it's so great, I should say. And so you need an image where where the texture of the paper unifies texture that you have throughout the image. As an example, let's say that this image had a big portion of it that was sky. Let's just imagine that situation. Well, of course, then Aquarel would not work because the texture would distract in the sky. In this case, I'm sure you can see now how that's not the case, how the texture really helps to complement what's already there, what the image is really all about. So I'm going to look at, see if we have any questions here, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. Is black point dependent on paper selection or just depends on the printer? So the black point of a paper depends on both the paper and the printer. As I've stated before, the Dmax of a paper, its measurement of how much black it can hold, that's determined by the surface of the paper, and so that's going to be inherent to the paper, but that is also dependent on the printer itself. Different printers have different amounts of capability to put ink on a piece of paper. And so another way of saying that is if I take Burita and I make two images on it, and I use two different printers that have different amounts of overall or total black density, yes, you're going to see a difference in black density because the printer's capabilities have to match up with the capabilities of the paper. And so that's why when you buy a new printer or you see manufacturers put out new printers, they will mention what the density of the printer is, and so that's something that you can take into account, again, depending on the kind of work that you do. If you do black and white or prints that you always want to have maximum density, again, you have to combine both a great paper like Burita or Burita Prestige and a printer that can support that. Another question, I recently got a Color Monkey. Should I create my own profiles or should I use the Canson profiles? That's a great question. I would suggest starting with the Canson profiles first. And the simple reason for that is because while a Color Monkey is a great device to be able to make your own profiles, the profiling equipment that Canson uses at the factory in France is of much higher quality than a Color Monkey. They're using the best quality that you can buy when it comes to making profiles. And so potentially the profiles are going to be more accurate. So I would suggest you start with the generic profiles that Canson provides on their website, and then decide if at that point you feel that they're not quite up to your liking or your standards or what have you, and then you can go ahead and try one of your profiles. But as a start, use theirs first. That'll save you some paper and ink, and then you can proceed from there. When will Burrito Prestige be available? That I can't answer for you. You'd have to contact Canson directly for that. I imagine it should be on the market or on sale any day now. It was supposed to be available for sale already, so I'm sure that it'll be on the market very, very soon. Here's another common question that I get: Epson or Canson? This question is difficult to answer because both Epson and, I'm sorry, I said Canson, Epson or Canon, excuse me. This question is difficult to answer because both Epson and Canon make excellent printers, and they're constantly upgrading and releasing new printers on the market all the time. So for example, now we have Epson's P series, the P800, P600, P400. We have Canon's newest printers like the Pro 1000, Pro 2000, and I've seen prints made on all these printers. They all look fantastic on Canson paper. So it's really hard to recommend one over the other. I can say this: I would not recommend one over the other in terms of quality. I actually happen to own both Epson and Canon printers, and I don't choose one over the other when it comes to quality. So go with whichever deal you get better at your retailer. If there's a rebate, both companies offer great rebates all the time. Maybe you're loyal to one company over the other. That's how I would choose. But again, very difficult to suggest or to recommend one over the other based on overall print quality. How do you print black and white images on Canson paper? In terms of the ICC profile, I definitely use an ICC profile whenever I print black and white images. I do not use the advanced black and white controls in Epson or the black and white mode in my Canon printer. The reason why I use the ICC profile is because number one, I feel that I'm getting as good a result, if not better, than using the advanced black and white mode. So I've tried both ways, and the results are the same, if not better. But even if they were the same, and many times they are, I still have more control in terms of making adjustments. Remember, the advanced black and white mode in the Epson driver doesn't allow you to preview any changes that you're making. Any changes that you make in terms of tinting or adding a tone or what have you, a sepia tone, you can't really preview that. And so I like to be able to preview exactly what I'm doing with an image in Lightroom. And also, if you do any kind of split toning in Lightroom on your images, once again, you can apply that much more effectively and with more options in Lightroom than you can in the driver. And again, as I said, the ICC profile gives me great neutral looking prints, especially black and white prints. Any comments, recommendations for black and white prints regarding paper choice? Well, I think I just spent the last 45 minutes talking about how I don't recommend or even think you should go about choosing one paper for black and white or color or what have you. Of course, we know that black and white prints in general do work better when we have higher contrast papers like Platine or Burrito. But again, that takes away, in my opinion, in my view, it takes away what a paper can lend to a photograph, to an image. Not every black and white image, as I showed before with the portraits, not every black and white image needs to be loud or aggressive or very contrasty. And so you can take advantage of the qualities of a softer, more nuanced paper, even with a black and white image. And I do this all the time. Again, that applies to my style. It applies to the kind of work that I'm doing. If you're a street photographer, if you'd like black and white images that are very punchy and dramatic, then of course that approach is going to be different for you. What's important here is that you know why you're choosing the paper. That's all that matters, and that you're getting the results that you want. If you know what you're trying to achieve, you have a roadmap, you have a sort of a vision in mind, then everything else is easier. Again, for me, I'm looking for something a little more nuanced. Many times I'm trying to convey a different sense or a different feel. I'm going to look at the papers that I think complement that best first, and I think about whether the image is black and white or color way afterwards. All right, folks, so that about wraps it up. I hope that this was informative and helpful. There should be a recording available of the webinar in the near future on the Canson Infinity website in case you want to watch it again. So on behalf of myself and Canson Infinity, thanks very much, and take care.